There are times in history when man's darkest experiences have produced some of his most beautiful expressions of emotion. The Great War was one of those times. On both sides, soldiers wrote diaries, letters, books, and poems that expressed what they were experiencing. Many of the greatest works produced during that time from men who before the war would never have considered themselves to be great writers. John McCrae was born in Ontario, Canada, the grandson of Scottish immigrants. In medical school, he tutored the other students to help pay his own tuition. After he graduated, he served as a lieutenant in the Second Boer War in South Africa before returning to practice medicine and teach pathology at the University of Vermont in the United States. When the Great War began, McCrae was appointed a major in the 1st Brigade Canadian Field Artillery. During the Second Battle of Ypres, he wrote one of the most vivid accounts of the horror of that battle that we have to this day. In a letter that he wrote home to his mother, he said, quote, "For 17 days and 17 nights, none of us have had our clothes off or even our boots, except occasionally. And all that time while I was awake, gunfire and rifle fire never ceased for 60 seconds. And behind it all was the constant background of the sights of the dead, the wounded, the maimed, and a terrible anxiety lest the line should give way." End quote. McCrae worked with the wounded here at the Essex Farm Advanced Dressing Station. And as many of the men that were treated here did not survive, the Essex Farm Cemetery began receiving burials around the same time. By April 25th, the Canadian forces here had lost 60% of their original strength of 10,000 men. The hospital and cemetery received new men every day. John McCrae continued to do his best for the streams of wounded and dying men that were brought here. On May 2nd, a close friend, Lieutenant Alexis Helmer, was struck by the direct hit of an 8-inch shell. There was very little left of his friend, but McCrae personally performed the burial service here. And during that service, he noticed how quickly poppies seemed to sprout up around the graves of the recently buried men. The next day, Major McCrae sat down and wrote his thoughts in a poem. "In Flanders fields, the poppies grow, between the crosses row on row that mark our place. And in the sky, the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved. And now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields." Witnesses to the occasion later recalled that McCrae would periodically look over at his friend's grave as he wrote. When he had finished, he shared the poem with a few people, but by all accounts, he was really quite unhappy with the work. And according to those accounts, he crumpled up the paper and threw it away. One of the men present had the sense to rescue the page, and he was able to convince McCrae to submit it for publication. Now, when the poem was published that December, and in many of the published works that followed, they changed the first line to say, "In Flanders fields the poppies blow," rather than "grow," which was what McCrae originally wrote. The poem itself was instantly popular. McCrae was proud of the poem's success. He hoped that it would help inspire men to do their duty. But he was also a little frustrated because it so often got published with the wrong word in the first line. Eventually, Major McCrae was permanently transferred from the artillery to the medical corps, and he was stationed in Boulogne, France in June of 1915. It was there that he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant colonel, and he was placed in charge of medicine at the No. 3 Canadian General Hospital. He was promoted to the acting rank of colonel on January 13th, 1918, and named consulting physician to the British armies in France. Unfortunately, Colonel McCrae contracted pneumonia the same day he was promoted, and later came down with cerebral meningitis. On January 28th, he died in the military hospital at Wimereux and was buried there with full military honors. As for the grave of his friend, like so many others, it was lost in the chaos of war, and it's now one of the many marked unknown here. His name was inscribed on the wall at the Meningate Memorial in the town. Well, I was really here at Essex Farm just to talk about John McCrae and the poem, but there is one grave I want to highlight while we're here. It's probably the most decorated grave in the cemetery. You see all of the crosses with poppies as well as a couple of teddy bears. It's because Valentine Stredwick was just a kid. He really was. He was 15 years old when he was killed in January of 1916 and buried here at Essex Farm. My son will be 15 in 2 weeks. I can't even begin to imagine what his parents went through. He was just a kid. A lot of these were just kids. As for the poem, it gained worldwide fame. Inspired by it, American professor Moyna Michael resolved at the end of the war to begin wearing a red poppy to honor the soldiers who died. She also wrote a poem of her own called "We Shall Keep the Faith." She distributed silk poppies to others and campaigned to have them adopted as an official symbol of remembrance by the American Legion. Now, another woman, Madame E. Guerin, attended the 1920 Legion Convention and was inspired to sell poppies in her native France in order to raise money for orphans of the war. In 1921, she sent poppy sellers to London ahead of Armistice Day. And that attracted the attention of Field Marshal Douglas Haig. Haig encouraged the sale of those poppies, and the practice quickly spread throughout the British Empire. Today, over 100 years later, the poppy has become the symbol of remembrance, especially when it comes to the men of the Great War.